Alaska opened fire before Japanese spotters even understood what they were looking at. It wasn't a battleship. It wasn't a cruiser. It was something else, something that violated every rule of naval warfare Japan believed it understood. The first 12-inch shells screamed across the Pacific like steel asteroids, each weighing over 140 pounds and traveling faster than a rifle bullet. When they struck, they didn't merely destroy targets, they deleted them. Reinforced concrete bunkers vaporized. Observation posts ceased to exist. Coastal fortifications built to withstand years of bombardment turned into plumes of dust in seconds. Japanese officers studying the debris recoiled. The ship responsible had the armor of a battleship, the speed of a heavy cruiser, and firepower that simply didn't belong in any known classification. The reports were so absurd that Tokyo's naval intelligence stamped a single word across them: unreal. They had no idea that what they discovered terrified US commanders as well. Before we go further, I need something from you. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in Los Angeles, Chicago, maybe somewhere near a naval base or in a small town I've never even heard of? Drop your city in the comments because I want to know exactly where this fleet of history-obsessed minds is assembled. And listen, if the idea of a ship so advanced that an enemy empire literally questioned reality itself is grabbing your attention, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, but it tells the YouTube algorithm that you're part of a crew that refuses to ignore the hidden weapons of American naval power. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We're just getting started. What comes next isn't speculation. It's classified level history that was almost buried under decades of secrecy. Strap in. What Alaska did was not supposed to be possible. Japanese naval intelligence had seen strange things before: experimental submarines, oversized cruisers, bizarre carrier configurations, but nothing prepared them for the Alaska class. The first intercepted specifications read like a fabrication: a ship displacing more than 34,000 tons, capable of pushing over 33 knots, mounting 12-inch 50 caliber Mark 8 naval rifles, the largest guns ever fitted to any cruiser on Earth. Those numbers were impossible. If true, the Alaska could outrun most US battleships and outgun every cruiser Japan had ever built. That alone was disturbing. The real shock came when analysts realized something far worse. This ship didn't have a defined weakness. The Yamato's flaw was speed. The Iowa's flaw was armor distribution. Every warship had a compromise, a trade-off. The Alaska didn't. Her Mark 8 guns were monsters, each barrel stretching over 50 calibers, firing 1,140-pound armor-piercing shells with enough kinetic energy to penetrate 12 inches of face-hardened steel at more than 20,000 yards. These weren't cruiser shells. These were battleship killers fired at cruiser speeds. Japanese officers stared at the ballistic tables and understood something horrifying. If Alaska caught a Takao-class cruiser, it wouldn't be a naval duel. It would be an execution. But raw firepower wasn't what terrified US commanders. It was what Alaska represented. A ship that blurred classifications, too big for a cruiser, too fast for a battleship, too heavily armed for anything Japan possessed. The US Navy had created a weapon it could barely categorize, forged under a new philosophy: control the range, control the battle. Alaska didn't just obey that doctrine, it weaponized it. Her engines churned out over 150,000 shaft horsepower, allowing her to close distance faster than any Japanese heavy cruiser. Once in range, her radar-directed fire control changed everything. The Mark 38 radar system didn't merely locate targets, it read them like signatures in the dark, correcting fire automatically. While Japanese ships relied on optical rangefinders and human estimation, Alaska used electrons and mathematics. The Imperial Navy still fought in 1941. Alaska fought in 1945. During pre-deployment gunnery tests in the Pacific, observers watched in stunned silence as Alaska fired salvo after salvo that landed within a shockingly tight pattern. A spread of 12 shells that should have scattered over hundreds of yards instead detonated inside a cluster smaller than a football field. Officers whispered among themselves. US commanders shifted uncomfortably. No cruiser was supposed to have this level of accuracy. No battleship this fast. No radar this precise. Some wondered if the Alaska class was overkill. Others feared it wasn't enough. They had good reason. Japan's long-lance torpedoes lurked beneath every engagement, oxygen-rich killers capable of traveling over 20,000 yards at nearly 49 knots with warheads weighing more than 200 pounds. One hit could cripple any ship alive. American ships feared torpedoes the way ground troops feared landmines. They turned victories into sudden funerals. But Alaska's designers anticipated this. Her torpedo defense system was layered, compartmentalized, and reinforced. Her hull could absorb punishment that would rip lesser cruisers apart. She was born to survive what the Pacific threw at her. In war rooms and briefing tables, whispers spread. The US had unleashed something unconventional, something that didn't belong to any naval doctrine that preceded it. A ship with the temperament of a predator, built not to duel, but to dominate, to erase. And then came the classified message that froze every American commander in place. Japan had finally identified the Alaska. They called her unreal, not because they misunderstood her, but because they understood her perfectly. When the Imperial Japanese Navy labeled the Alaska unreal, it wasn't hyperbole. It was a confession. Their intelligence officers dug deeper, and what they uncovered triggered panic-level briefings in Tokyo. The Alaska class wasn't merely a new ship, it was a new category of warfare. A vessel designed around a disruptive idea: eliminate the enemy before they understand they're in a fight. To grasp the scale of the threat, Japanese analysts compared Alaska directly to their proud heavy cruisers. The Takao class, for example, displaced around 15,075 tons and carried 10 8-inch guns. On paper, formidable. In practice, Takao's shells weighed roughly 260 pounds. Alaska's shells weighed over 4 times that, with muzzle velocities capable of punching through armor that Takao wasn't even designed to face. It was like bringing a katana to stop a freight train. Worse still, Alaska's 12-inch Mark 8 guns were optimized for long-range lethality. The propellant and shell design allowed her to loft rounds at extreme distances, creating plunging trajectories that threatened deck armor rather than belt armor, Japan's Achilles heel. The Imperial Navy had invested heavily in side protection, expecting surface duels. They were not prepared for artillery that could fall from above like guided thunder. But firepower wasn't the most frightening element. Information was. Alaska integrated radar fire control systems capable of tracking, predicting, and correcting shellfall before the enemy even saw the salvo. While Japanese gunners visually estimated distance using rangefinders, plagued by smoke, glare, and sea spray, Alaska operated like a sniper, reading wind vectors in darkness. Her Mark 13 radar didn't just replace eyesight, it erased human error. She could engage targets concealed by weather, night, or smoke screens. She saw without seeing. Imagine being a Japanese commander aboard a heavy cruiser, confident in doctrine refined through decades of naval tradition. You maneuver, calculate bearing, adjust speed, everything your training demanded. Suddenly, shells land precisely around your hull before you've even located the source. Every adjustment you make is anticipated. Every evasive maneuver is countered. It wasn't combat. It was a sentencing. Rumors spread among Japanese officers. Was Alaska a prototype? Was she alone? If the Americans had built a fleet of these ships, then the Pacific balance wasn't shifting. It was collapsing. Inside US, naval strategy rooms, another conversation unfolded, one that never made it into wartime propaganda. Commanders weren't only proud of Alaska, they were intimidated by her. A ship designed so aggressively that it forced a fundamental question. Had the Navy built a weapon too far ahead of its doctrine? Alaska consumed enormous fuel. Her guns demanded meticulous maintenance. Her ammunition logistics were monstrous. She was a war machine that required perfection. Feed her anything less and she became a liability. American command didn't fear Japan misunderstanding the Alaska. They feared Japan understanding her too well. The Pacific was vast, treacherous, and unpredictable. A ship with Alaska's capabilities was unstoppable, if she could be supplied, positioned, and defended from submarines. Her armor was thick, but torpedoes didn't care about steel thickness. They cared about luck. A single hit from a Type 93 could doom even giants. So the stage was set, a ship that terrified one empire and unsettled the navy that built her. A weapon with no equal, sailing into a war defined by ambushes, island fortresses, and unseen threats lurking beneath every wave. And as fate would have it, Alaska would soon face the very class of ship Japan believed could outrun, outmaneuver, and possibly outgun her: the Takao. What happened next would make even seasoned U.S. officers whisper, "We didn't design her for this, but God help whoever stands in front of her." The confrontation with the Takao class wasn't supposed to be a duel. In U.S. strategic planning, Alaska was a fleet dominator, an apex predator that dictated terms, not one that traded blows. Yet the Pacific had a twisted sense of humor, and soon Alaska would find herself sailing directly into the shadow of one of Japan's most dangerous surface combatants. The Takao-class cruiser wasn't an amateur's toy. Displacing nearly 16,000 tons, mounting 10 8-inch guns, and armored well enough to bully anything smaller than a battleship, Takao represented the peak of Japanese cruiser doctrine: speed, firepower, and intimidation. Her salvos could rip apart destroyers and punch holes in cruisers before they even looped around for a second pass. The Imperial Navy considered Takao untouchable within her weight class. Then the Alaska appeared and rewrote the food chain. When U.S. reconnaissance planes identified Takao operating in a contested sector of the Pacific, interest among American commanders spiked. This wasn't just an enemy ship. This was an opportunity to validate a theory. Could Alaska, the unreal behemoth, annihilate a cruiser Japan regarded as a capital threat? Or would Alaska's design collapse under real, sustained fire? What made the encounter terrifying for Japan wasn't how fast Alaska closed distance, but how little time Takao had to react. Running at over 33 knots, Alaska moved like a predator with a clock in its veins, guided by radar sweeps that painted the ocean with invisible precision. Her fire control computer projected future enemy positions based on Takao's last movement, meaning Alaska wasn't aiming where Takao was, it was aiming where Takao would be. Takao's captain attempted evasive maneuvers. It didn't matter. Alaska's first salvo landed so close to the Japanese cruiser that fragments ripped through deck plating and smashed communication antennas. Japanese spotters screamed bearings, but before a correction could be issued, a second salvo arrived, closer, tighter, deadlier. Takao's crew felt the ship vibrate under the concussive shock, a reminder not of impact, but inevitability. The psychological shift was instantaneous. For the first time, Japanese sailors understood what their analysts had warned. Alaska killed distance. She didn't negotiate range, she owned it. Takao attempted to return fire, unleashing her 8-inch guns with the fury of a cornered monster. Her rounds tore through the sky at 2,800 feet per second, slamming into the ocean and throwing geysers high enough to paint Alaska's deck with salt spray. But hitting Alaska was like shooting at a ghost. She moved faster than expected, her helm responding with a grace no ship that massive should possess. Then came the salvo that changed everything. Alaska fired a spread at long range, each 12-inch shell guiding a death sentence through mathematics and velocity. One shell struck Takao's forward section, detonating near the Type 89 high-angle gun mounts. The explosion wasn't cinematic, it was surgical. Armor peeled back like torn metal skin. Bulkheads buckled. Fire erupted below deck. Takao didn't sink, not yet, but she was no longer a hunter. She was prey. American spotters later wrote that the effect wasn't merely physical, it was existential. Takao had been built to dominate cruisers. Alaska was a cruiser only by name. In reality, she was a battleship wearing a disguise, and Takao had walked right into the masquerade. The shockwave rippled beyond the battle. Japanese command now understood. Alaska wasn't an outlier. She was a warning. If this ship became standard, Japan's naval doctrine was obsolete. And the U.S. Navy? They weren't celebrating. They were terrified of what they had unleashed. The aftermath of Alaska's strike against Takao sent shockwaves far beyond the Pacific horizon. In Tokyo, senior officers pored over fragmented reports, trying to reconcile what had just happened with everything they believed about naval warfare. A cruiser should not outrange a heavy cruiser. A cruiser should not penetrate reinforced armor at those distances. A cruiser should not force a Takao-class vessel, one of Japan's crown jewels, into a defensive retreat after a single accurate volley. But that was the trap. Alaska wasn't a cruiser. She was a weaponized contradiction. What unsettled Japanese analysts most wasn't the damage inflicted. It was how Alaska delivered it. Traditional naval engagements relied on pattern recognition, movements, silhouettes, muzzle flashes. Alaska stripped that comfort away. She didn't behave like a surface ship. She behaved like a machine that predicted outcomes. By the time an enemy captain issued orders, Alaska's computers were already calculating the counter. Inside U.S. command rooms, officers debated the implications. Alaska could break naval formations, disrupt island defenses, and wipe out enemy cruisers. But she demanded a new way of thinking. Her range meant she could force engagements before adversaries even came into visual contact. Her speed meant she could chase down anything short of a destroyer. And her armor protection, 7 to 9 inches of belt armor, deck reinforcement, torpedo defenses, meant torpedoes were no longer a guarantee, only a gamble. The psychological effect was devastating. Japanese sailors began referring to Alaska as a face you never see. Radar-directed shells appeared out of nowhere, striking with supernatural accuracy. Stories circulated that Alaska could hit you through fog, through mist, even through pitch-black nights. To a navy trained to fight with eyesight, the Alaska was a phantom. But the United States faced a different fear: logistics. Alaska drank fuel like a battleship. Her guns consumed ammunition stocks at absurd rates. She couldn't operate alone, and if she fell into a torpedo trap, her loss would be catastrophic, both militarily and symbolically. A superweapon that dies becomes a myth of failure. U.S. admirals weren't afraid of Alaska's power. They were afraid of her dying before proving it justified. Then a new concern emerged. Japan wouldn't challenge Alaska with cruisers anymore. They would send submarines. The Pacific was crawling with them. Rho-class, I-class, Type B-1 boats with scouting aircraft, and especially the dreaded chiton-equipped units, whose pilots were trained to die rather than return. Japanese doctrine began shifting to a singular question. If Alaska cannot be killed by guns, can she be killed by desperation? American convoys altered routes. Escort screens tightened. Destroyers ran sonar sweeps with renewed paranoia. Alaska remained composed, her decks quiet, her guns silent. But beneath that steel calm was a truth U.S. command dared not admit. They had built a ship strong enough to frighten an empire, yet fragile enough that a single torpedo could end the illusion. Still, Alaska pressed forward. In war, weapons are not judged by design sheets, they are judged by fear, and Japan feared Alaska, not her size, not her guns, not her radar. They feared the idea behind her, a ship that erased the boundaries of naval warfare, a ship that turned classifications into irrelevance, a ship that made doctrine obsolete. And somewhere in that realization, a question formed, one that neither side knew how to answer. What happens when a navy builds something it cannot fully control? As Alaska moved deeper into operational waters, a chilling pattern emerged. Every time she appeared on radar screens, Japanese forces reacted with disproportionate urgency. Destroyers scrambled, reconnaissance planes diverted, submarines repositioned. It wasn't strategy, it was instinct. Alaska didn't just alter the tactical landscape, she warped it. Her presence alone forced Japan to defend against a threat they didn't know how to quantify. To the Imperial Navy, warships were categories. Battleships existed to duel battleships. Carriers ruled the skies. Cruisers patrolled and supported. Alaska broke that chain like a hammer through glass. A cruiser that carried battleship-grade artillery was an abomination to doctrine. It meant every engagement was a coin toss, where Japan didn't know which side was heads. Japanese engineers studied the Mark 8 armor-piercing shells and were horrified. These projectiles weren't simple hunks of steel. They were precision-forged killers with ballistic caps designed to maintain velocity after impact. They didn't flatten. They punched through, detonating inside the target like internal grenades. Against Takao-class cruisers, whose armor averaged just 4 inches along the belt. Alaska's shells didn't penetrate. They over-penetrated, leaving trails of devastation through compartments previously considered safe zones. Radar reports leaked between Japanese commands, filtered, censored, but unmistakable. Alaska could track ships at distances where Takau's gunners were effectively blind. Worse, Alaska's fire control system didn't panic. It didn't tire. It didn't misjudge smoke or haze. It processed, calculated, and fired with an indifference that felt less like warfare and more like extermination. The psychological toll was nuclear. Officers who once believed in Japan's naval supremacy now whispered doubts behind closed doors. What good were torpedoes if you couldn't get close enough to fire them? What value had speed if the enemy could predict every turn? What did armor mean if shells ignored it like paper? Meanwhile, American officers faced a different emotion: temptation. Alaska was proving herself. The crew felt it, engineers felt it, commanders felt it. The U.S. Navy had created something on the edge of doctrine, and now that edge drew blood. Rumors began circulating of future Alaska-class variants, bigger guns, thicker armor, even faster designs. Some believed the Alaska was merely the prototype of a new naval race, one America could win before Japan had time to comprehend its starting point. But hidden beneath the pride was anxiety. Alaska's power forced escalation. If America built the next Alaska, Japan would respond. If Japan responded, America would answer. Naval warfare risked evolving into a technological arms spiral with no brakes. And lurking beneath this progression was something darker. Alaska wasn't built to fight ships. She was built to eliminate ideas. She killed the Japanese cruiser doctrine. She killed the assumption that classifications defined power. She killed the belief that the Pacific could be controlled with existing tools, and Japan knew it. Their analysts issued a final chilling report, circulated only among the highest-ranking naval officers. This vessel should not exist. If multiple units are produced, the balance of the Pacific is mathematically unsalvageable. Mathematically, not strategically, not theoretically, mathematically. To a nation defined by naval pride, those words were poison. They signaled a reality no emperor could decree away. If Alaska was the future, then Japan was already in the past, and the Pacific was about to prove it. Japan's final attempt to contextualize the Alaska came not from admirals, but mathematicians. Analysts crunched engagement ranges, shell velocities, turning radii, radar acquisition times, and structural tolerances until a terrifying pattern emerged. Alaska didn't fit into the Pacific War. They did. Every doctrine Japan relied upon had been built for a battlefield that no longer existed. Alaska wasn't responding to enemy strategy. Enemy strategy now responded to her. The Imperial Navy's last hope lay not in guns, but in shadows. Submarines, silent, patient, merciless. The I-boat captains were briefed not to sink Alaska immediately, but to observe her, stalk her, learn her habits. They needed a weakness, any weakness, a blind spot in radar, a turning radius vulnerable to torpedo spread, a thermal signature that could be exploited at night. They found none. Destroyers escorting Alaska operated in concentric layers. Sonar operators swept relentlessly, their systems tuned specifically to detect patterns associated with Japan's Type 93 torpedoes. Depth charge racks remained loaded around the clock. The Pacific below the Alaska was not water. It was a graveyard waiting for trespassers. Still, Japan persisted. One I-class submarine managed to get within striking distance, creeping in at less than 3 knots, engines silenced, hull coated with sound-dampening compounds. The captain aligned 2 Type 93 torpedoes, the Long Lance, 49 knots of death, with a warhead heavier than some artillery shells. He fired. Alaska never saw them. Her escorts did. Sonar screams erupted. Destroyers peeled off like wolves breaking formation. Depth charges detonated in a rolling cascade, turning the ocean into a blender of concussive shockwaves. Minutes later, an oil slick floated to the surface, followed by debris, then silence. The submarine never had a chance. For Alaska's crew, the message was clear. They weren't merely manning a warship. They were riding the apex of modern warfare. Every engagement, every radar ping, every salvo reinforced a truth Japan refused to accept. The Alaska was not a ship. She was a decision that said the United States would never again enter a naval war evenly matched. The Alaska class represented an ideological shift, one that weaponized industrial capacity, scientific precision, and psychological dominance. Her existence was proof that America wasn't just fighting Japan. It was outgrowing the war faster than Japan could adapt. Japan's final classified assessment reads like a eulogy. If one Alaska-class vessel can operationally deny our cruisers and invalidate our doctrines, a fleet of them would erase the Imperial Navy before engagement is achieved. Erase, not defeat, not overwhelm. Erase. That word hung like ash over every strategy session, because deep down every man in those rooms understood something horrible. You cannot outfight a weapon designed to remove the need for a fight. By the time Japan realized what the Alaska truly represented, it was already too late. Their cruisers were obsolete. Their doctrines were artifacts. Their future had been shattered by a vessel they could neither counter nor comprehend. And somewhere, beneath the thunder of her guns and the hum of her radar arrays, Alaska carried a quiet truth. The Pacific War wasn't decided by numbers, or fleets, or heroes. It was decided by an idea. An American idea, forged in steel, wrapped in firepower, launched into a world unprepared for what came next. In the end, Alaska didn't just carve her name into naval history, she carved a fault line through it. She stood as proof that warfare evolves not through tradition, but through audacity. Her guns bent doctrines, her radar shattered assumptions, and her very existence forced empires to rethink what power meant on the open sea. The men who served aboard her, the engineers who forged her steel, and the minds who dared to imagine a warship beyond categories, they were not just participants. They were architects of a new era. To every sailor who braved the Pacific, to every ship that carried the stars and stripes into hostile waters, to every piece of machinery that turned metal into might, we owe a debt of remembrance. They proved that innovation is not an accident. It is deliberate. It is American. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear boiler suits and stand behind 12-inch guns. End of transmission.